Hi everyone, welcome to our session on Learning Unit 1. This session covers theme 1 to 5 and looks at the factors contributing to crime in South Africa. Here are our learning outcomes for this unit. There are various explanations for crime, deviance, and criminal behavior, and these explanations should not be viewed in isolation or separated from one another. So it's better to get an understanding of the different actions if we combine our theories, and this is known as following a multi-dimensional approach. One of the major theoretical developments of recent times involves attempts to integrate two or more theories to produce better explanations for misbehavior, and the earliest of these were referred to as multi-factor theories. This suggests that social, personal, and economic factors all influence criminal behavior, and as a consequence, variables from different theoretical perspectives are combined to get the purest, most comprehensive explanation for behavior. One single factor is seldom the cause for crime, and there are many reasons why an individual would become involved in crime. And this is evident in the fact that we have many different theories in criminology. It's also evident that the longer a criminal gets away with crime, the more likely it is that the criminal will graduate to more serious, high-return, high-risk violent crimes. It's also evident that the younger a person is when they first become involved in crime, the greater the chances that they will become seriously violent adult criminals. Internationally, police are moving away from reactive policing, where the focus is on the crime incident, and they are now concentrating more on proactive or intelligence-led policing. So ILP represents a change in crime control thinking and related policing practices, and it focuses on intelligence gathering and the proactive strategies that are designed around the gathered information. The focus has also shifted to the criminal, so ILP uses the 80-20 principle, where 80% of the crime is committed by 20% of the population. So by focusing on intelligence gathering and analysis in order to find criminals and discover what their motives are, it is possible to implement more effective policing tasks. ILP has provided a very effective means to deal with crime, and it is something that is now being adopted across spaces. There is a lot of authoritative and credible research on the link between poor socioeconomic conditions and crime. If we look at poor living conditions, the majority of the South African population lives in underdeveloped, disorganized communities, and the living conditions of people in informal settlements are worsened by a low employment rate. Many families and individuals do not have a steady income, and a large number of these people live below the breadline. This means that their income is not always enough for them to have sufficient food supplies every day, and many of them struggle to survive. The poor economic situation has a knock-on effect on other socioeconomic conditions. Poor economic growth results in insufficient resources to fund social services and housing projects. The result is inadequate public schooling, insufficient clean water, bad sanitation, and inadequate health care. Another effect is that the lack of healthcare and health education causes higher rates of HIV/AIDS that often leads to the deaths of the main income earners in a family. If we look at our material and financial needs, while your poor socioeconomic conditions contribute towards circumstances that are conducive to committing specific crimes, there's also another aspect that's related to the financial and materialistic expectations of the criminal. So in research on robberies with aggravating circumstances in South Africa, they found that even though socioeconomic conditions might have been the trigger that got these perpetrators involved in crime, Other aspects such as greed, power, and instant gratification played a very large role in their continued involvement, especially in violent crimes like armed robberies, farm attacks, etc. South Africans live in a very materialistic society where possessions and physical comfort are valued above spiritual values and morality. So in a society where status comes from wealth and possessions, the very poor and marginalized people become the outcasts of society. And these materialistic yardsticks also apply to the poorest of the poor. Financial independence and materialism of society puts a huge burden on everyone who's not in a position to compete on this level. So one way of immediately improving one's position is to commit a crime and get that instant economic reward. When a person is robbed of a possession like a cell phone, that possession holds a certain economic status or other value for its new owner. And the economic value depends on the type of item that is stolen and also the frequency with which the robber acquires new items. So when we compare socioeconomic conditions, we speak about something known as relative deprivation. And this is the discrepancy that one perceives between what one has and what one could or should have. Another term is absolute deprivation. And absolute deprivation refers to not having the bare necessities for living. Poor neighborhoods often suffer from a very deficient infrastructure, dilapidated buildings, rundown streets, no sewage, no refuse removal systems, poor street lighting, etc. All of these factors give rise to an environment that is conducive to crime. The type of situation also makes this area very difficult to access, and it restricts the mobility of police and other support, as well as your emergency services. These conditions usually go hand in hand with problems in the social fabric, such as alcohol abuse, drug abuse, domestic violence, and a general deterioration in community life. Your poor, marginalized, and badly managed neighborhoods, as well as your poor socioeconomic conditions, result in what is known as a disorganized society. Some elements of a disorganized society are children not attending school, crime gangs forming as an alternative social structure to the family, illegal activities such as drug peddling, and a general collapse of control. Usually, no social progress or development takes place in a neighborhood in this condition, and these crime-generating situations, which are unfortunately very common in South African communities, allow crime to go unchecked and then to flourish. Unfortunately, many citizens of these communities support the criminal element because they often benefit from the spoils of crime. In some cases, there is inadequate or no provision of the basics like your medical services, recreational facilities, water, sanitation, electricity, etc. And these factors add to the problems of disorganized and disrupted societies. The more disorganized societies become, the more criminal activities increase. These conditions then contribute to people being marginalized and having very little control over their own living conditions. It also encourages the growth of a subculture of crime within these communities. Another factor is lack of parental discipline. Violent criminals in South Africa generally have very little or no education. Many of these criminals come from so-called broken homes, and a lot of them have had a disrupted childhood. It is evident that many needy young people are prone not to succeed in life because they live in a disorganized society. However, we should be careful not to blame only these factors for people getting involved in crime. People ultimately have the ability to choose whether or not they want to get involved in crime, and also they might look at whether or not they want to face the mechanisms of the criminal justice system. However, these conditions do play a role in making it more difficult to choose a crime-free existence, even though that choice does remain possible. Another factor related to the lack of parental guidance is the number of households in South Africa that are now headed by a minor. So these are known as our child-headed households, and these households are without parents as guardians because a lot of parents may have died from diseases such as HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, as well as malaria. The lack of maturity in these new heads of households tends to give rise to poor discipline and also a lack of education. In many instances, young people in these households eventually gravitate towards a life of crime, and the bottom line is that many children grow up without healthy parental supervision and with a lack of balanced discipline. This is extremely important in the development of a moral compass and also for children to internalize moral principles. Growing up in a healthy, balanced, loving family structure promotes self-worth when moral principles are maintained, and also self-condemnation when they are violated. So moral disengagement is more likely when somebody grows up with a lack of healthy parental discipline and guidance. Research on crime prevention has shown that a subculture of crime easily develops in areas or neighborhoods where policing patrols or activities are non-existent or ineffective. When there is no effective guarding or proactive policing, a neighborhood is left vulnerable to crime. Poor socioeconomic conditions and accompanying urbanization have also created in areas in South Africa that are very difficult to police. This gives ample opportunity for criminals to hide in these disorganized communities. Criminals move within an informal settlement quite easily when they learn that the police are looking for them. These areas are fertile ground for the institutionalization of a subculture of crime. So some people in the lower income classes find this subculture an attractive alternative because the rural and urban poor find it impossible to meet the behavioral demands of your middle income class society. The criminal subculture is linked to social problems such as poverty and inequality, and the neighborhood therefore in many respects condones that violence. These higher rates of violence amongst your lower income class people could be explained by the fact that these groups have embraced values and norms that are more permissive of violence. Violence becomes a normal behavioral skill that is needed to survive and make ends meet. However, it remains very important to keep in mind that many marginalized people that live in these informal settlements are very good law-abiding citizens who just happen to be caught up in an environment where they are intimidated by a criminal element taking refuge in a disorganized society. We also speak about ganglands. So disorganized communities are advantageous to criminals that operate from or hide in them. The disorganized environment acts as a barrier of relative safety for criminals. So they go about their legal business activities in the settlement, or they commit crime elsewhere and then go back to the safety of that neighborhood. Research has found that in most instances, the families, friends, and community members of these criminals know about their involvement in crime. However, they don't inform the authorities about their whereabouts. Members of the communities from which that robber operated often buy stolen goods from them at reduced prices, and this then creates a demand market under illicit circumstances. A criminally supportive subculture therefore exists within these communities with a ready supply of appliances, stolen firearms, as well as vehicles. This phenomenon is fairly common in these types of communities. This informal supply and demand hierarchy in disorganized communities are often referred to as ganglands. So the criminal gangland allows for the easy disposal of stolen property to a demand structure from mostly legal buyers. So in turn, the criminals are protected by the people in the community who associate themselves with the criminal activity because they reap the benefit from the crimes. These communities usually consider police to be outsiders and they close ranks against them. So they don't provide any information about criminals, and they even actively protect the criminal elements and gangsters from being arrested. Some sections of the neighborhoods have become no-go zones for the SAPS, and they are owned by gang lords and syndicates unless large numbers of police can enter by force. In South Africa, different national and international syndicates are active. Some syndicates are involved in profitable violent crime activities like cash in transit heists, while others will poach rhino horns, harvest abalone illegally, manufacture drugs, or even facilitate the transport of those substances internationally. In other cases, syndicates may entice individuals in online scams or buy vehicles online only to steal a vehicle from an uninformed client. Each syndicate has their own niche, field of operation, and their own modus operandi. Some syndicates combine different illegal activities to enhance their profits. Some syndicates would go into property-related crime and hijack entire street blocks, which they then control and monitor. All communities are affected by crime. Your more affluent communities seem to be targeted more by financially motivated crimes such as robbery involving car hijackings, home invasions, and burglaries. Your less affluent communities appear to be more affected by social fabric crimes such as common assaults, street robbery, which are often exacerbated by alcohol abuse. In other instances, predisposing factors like biological constitutional factors are put forward to explain criminal behavior, and the general argument in these explanations is from your positivist viewpoint, that these criminals are born this way or that they are predisposed to commit crime. Linking to this, some explain their crimes by referring to physiological aspects of the person, such as hormones and neurotransmitters. For every individual, a discernible mix of psychological, social, interpersonal, biological, and neurophysiological features make them vulnerable to wrongdoing in an environment that condones or stimulates crime. A person who grew up in a poor area, who was abused and neglected, who did not get the necessary socialization skills and internal buffers from a caring, balanced parent, who regularly observed significant others making a living from crime, and who's also born with certain predisposing characteristics and a temperament that justifies their decision to commit crime, might be at a higher risk to commit crime. However, again, not all young people with this type of profile will commit crime. Many of them do not follow a criminal pathway, and they desist from crime no matter what their situation is and all the pull factors. So, for example, if they have delinquent peers who commit crime or abuse drugs that will invite them to commit crime, they will still not engage in those activities. From a classical school perspective, we can also not blame the others or specific situations, because many people have a choice whether or not they want to get involved in crime or to choose the straight and narrow path of conformity in pursuing their cultural goals. The predisposing reasons why people commit crime and the combinations of these reasons are infinite, so we can't narrow it down to one specific factor. In terms of our perception and our coping methods with crime, the official South African Police Service statistics indicate that all communities in South Africa are affected by high crime rates. These deductions are based on police stats, but they're generally supported by other research into crime as well. Humans simplify situations in order to understand them or to cope in these situations, and they also use cognitive structures or specific patterns of thinking to justify behaviors that would otherwise be unacceptable. Once someone is dehumanized through this thought process, normal standards of social behavior that would usually apply to human beings no longer applies to them. So they're no longer seen as a human, and any form of punishment may then be meted out to them, such as capital punishment. Some people justify capital punishment by saying that some criminals are subhuman or similar to animals, and to them it follows that killing subhuman animals is more acceptable than killing people. So it becomes easier to mistreat and kill strangers who are stripped of their human qualities. If we look at South Africa's past of low-intensity warfare, South Africa has a very long history of political strife that coincided with the use of violence in order to achieve liberation. Every person at any social level could become a victim of a crime, and until fairly recently, South Africa was involved in what military experts call low-intensity warfare, either forced dispersal, civil unrest, or a liberation struggle. Both sides of the conflict used military techniques to achieve their aims, and until 1994, this low-intensity war was part of daily life in South Africa. And the warfare techniques included forced dispersal, boycotts, civil unrest, liberation before education campaigns, defiance of oppressive laws, draconian enforcement of laws, etc. The youth were then militarized through training in warfare and military duty, and experts agree that these techniques leave marks on the psyche of a nation. So one of the side effects of this exposure to violence is that people learn to resort to violence and public disobedience when they encounter any resistance or when they are faced with a threat. Another unfortunate event is that over time, people develop a very negative attitude towards law enforcement agencies that then are enforcing these unpopular laws or regulations. The armed struggle and similar liberation actions in southern African regions have also left the region saturated with small arms and ammunition. The easy access to firearms makes it even simpler for criminals to get these firearms and use them when committing these violent crimes. If we look at the image of the SAPS during the apartheid era, the police were seen as the pawns of the government. So the police force was demilitarized and was changed to a service for the people. Although the staffing of this newly transformed police service was largely representative of the South African population, a negative popular opinion persisted towards policing in South Africa. The SAPS appears to be wrestling with basic policing approaches, constant restructuring, changes to their corporate identity and image, and this state of flux in the heart of police management and the lack of training has impacted on crime management in South Africa on many levels. Police's incompetence and lack of training led many police officials to be corrupt. They are disrespectful, unethical, and unprincipled, and many honorable, hard-working career police officials have had to bear the brunt of this problem. It's also contributed to the community losing trust in the police and indirectly contributed to the inability to manage crime, especially violent crime in South Africa. If a police service is ineffective in investigating, tracing, arresting, and prosecuting offenders, it creates a situation where criminals believe that the chances of arrest are small. Many individuals take this into account before they start a life of crime. Criminals and potential criminals believe that crime does pay in South Africa. So instead of respect and fear for the criminal justice system, a sense of being untouchable is created and is then informally advertised to potential criminals. The image of the police has not only been tainted by the police's role in enforcing unpopular laws during apartheid and their poor performance in apprehending and securing convictions against criminals, but also by corruption within the police force itself. There are often reports about the police officials that have been found guilty of corruption, and this is all the more reason for the public not to want to cooperate with the police and criminals who believe that they'll be able to buy off the police. So the situation provides more reason for criminals to believe that it's worth the risk of committing crime, because even if they are arrested, they'll be able to bribe the police into releasing them. A police service with endemic corruption allows criminals to take control of communities and to continue to expand their criminal activities. This also leads to crime syndicates and organized crime activities going unhindered. The content for these slides was taken from Prescribed Material 1, a South African perspective on fundamental criminology.